All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Andrew Weiss. I'm Vice President for Studies here at Carnegie. I'm really delighted to welcome everybody here, as well as people who are watching online. This is, I think, a very timely discussion for obvious reasons, given the tumult in the Middle East that we've witnessed in the past couple weeks. Before we get started, I do want to mention that people who are in the room have cards in front of you with a QR code, and you can scan that QR code to submit questions, which will be fed up to me over the course of the discussion today. And then people who are watching remotely can also submit questions through the chat feature on YouTube. So just please, start populating those questions, and we'll feed them into the conversation. Because it's my hope very much that this will be a kind of active conversation as opposed to simply a series of presentations. We have 4 stellar panelists with us today to talk about the question of security competition in the Middle East and the Horn of Africa. To my right is Amr Hamzali. Amr is a senior fellow at Carnegie and the director of our Middle East program. As is known to most of you, Amr was a professor of political science at Cairo University and was also a member of the first parliament elected in Egypt after the revolution in 2011. To Amr's right is Isaac Carden, who is also a senior fellow at Carnegie in our Asia program, who is a specialist on China's involvement in the global commons and in maritime environments. Before coming to Carnegie, he was a faculty member at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. On the screen, we have 2 important colleagues. We have Dr. Abdulaziz Sagar, who is the founder and chairman of the Gulf Research Center, who is based in Dubai.
Yes.
And also Nicole Graevsky, who is a fellow at Carnegie's nuclear policy program and a longtime observer of Russian-Iranian relations and the author of a forthcoming book, which a lot of us are eager to get our hands on, Russia and Iran Partners in Defiance from Syria to Ukraine. So before we get started, maybe Amr, if you could kind of provide a little bit of a framing, both to talk about the work Carnegie's been doing in the past few months on regional competition, the role of outside powers and local actors, and then maybe also to sort of frame the scale of the upheaval that we're witnessing as a result of the revolution in Syria.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to join you and join Isaac, Nicole, and my dear friend Abdulaziz. It's once again an interesting time and a difficult time in the Middle East and North Africa. Let me maybe offer 5 framing remarks. One, before coming to our work here at Carnegie and what we have been doing with regard to researching the great power competition and different dynamics between the great powers, the US, China, Russia, and the Europeans, and key regional actors on the ground in the Middle East. Let me start by stating that what has been happening in Syria, unfolding in Syria in the last few weeks, is a highly contested issue in the region. Some would see it as not only a fall of a dictatorship, but would see it as a revolution leading maybe to a hopeful democratic future. Many others in the region are skeptical, and skeptical for 2 reasons. One, the fact that those who took over power in Syria are, to say the least, violent, radical groups, where many have legitimate doubts about where they will stand in Syria's multi-ethnic and multi-religious social fabric with regard to equal citizenship rights, with regard to freedoms, with regard to inclusion and governance standards. So this is a highly contested issue, and I believe within Syria it's contested, outside of Syria it's contested. And I belong to those who are skeptical and weary of what the takeover of a group of radical Islamist forces would mean for governance scenarios in Syria as well as beyond Syria. Second point is what is happening or has been happening in Syria is not only domestic, it has clear regional and international implications and has only come into being by means of regional and international interference in many different ways, which I'm not going to outline. But when I look at the Syrian map right now, I see two big regional powers actively pursuing their own agendas and their own national security interests, Turkey and Israel. Turkey in the north, Israel in the southern part of Syria. Before I came to the panel, there are new reports that Israel is contesting more territory in Syria beyond the Golan Heights and the previously neutral zone, which is now under Israeli control. But as well, and here I'm very much looking forward to hearing Nicole's take, to expect Iran after its long-term investment, Andrew, in Syria. And Iran's investment in Syria dates back to the 1980s, to the Iraq-Iran war between 1980 and 1988. The Iranians groomed back then Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father and long-time ruler of Syria, as their ally in the region. And they have been investing in Syria economically, financially, militarily, and they have been the power behind the Assad regime up until the very, very end. To expect Iran and its different allies in the region, non-state actors primarily, beyond the collapsed Assad regime, to give up on its investment and not to be regrouping or trying to figure out a way of influencing Syria's future is probably less realistic. But so I see two big regional powers, Turkey and Israel, and I see Iran as well attempting to regroup. And I'm very much looking forward to Abdelaziz's comments on Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, but the Gulf, big question marks about how they look at the Syrian realities. Third framing comment, international actors are important as well. Russia is classified as a big loser of the change in Syria, but this is too early to judge as well. We are looking at a scene which is highly dynamic, and it's very difficult to come to a determination whether Russia is exiting its long-standing ally, Syria, whether the US is going to be doing more than protecting its Kurdish allies and avoiding any regrouping of ISIS and ISIS-affiliated groups. The Europeans seem to be diplomatically active. They have been sending delegations to Syria in the last days. This is a highly dynamic scene. Fourth and last framing comment, I believe, and here I come to the work which we have been doing at Carnegie, it's important to look at the great power competition that has been unfolding in the region away from the simple generalizations we've been hearing a lot about in recent years, that the US is retreating or China is on the rise. A great deal of the discussion about China on the rise started right after the successful Chinese mediation between the Saudis and the Iranians with regard to restoring diplomatic relations and Yemen. But when you look at the details of it, be it comes to military deployment, arms sales, trade relations, technology investments, FDIs, what have you, diplomatic missions, the US tops everyone's with regard to its presence in the region, in the Middle East and North Africa, and continues to be the most dominant superpower. And if there is a big strategic outcome of the region in war since October 7, 2023, is when it comes to international actors to say that it is the US which has been left, in fact, with the different missions of stabilizing here, securing there, interfering at the southern entry point of the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa, which Isaac will address. But it's important to keep in mind that we should look at the details of what's happening, unfolding on the ground, militarily, trade, economically, diplomatically, and to see the interactions between regional powers and international powers. And I will end on that. It's not that the influence of the great powers is not mediated via the actions, proactive, assertive foreign policies of different key regional actors. I'm identifying 7 in our work at the Middle East program: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Iran, Turkey, Israel, and Qatar. For different reasons, different capacities of these 7 actors, but these are the big actors on the ground which have come to mediate the role of international powers.
Thanks, Amr. That's really helpful as a setting. Before we turn to the other panelists, let me just push you a bit further, where most actors would agree they were surprised by the scale of the fall of the Assad regime. we saw tremendous local agency and some outside support that helped bring that about. But that is a stark contrast from the picture that we had at the beginning of the war in the, say, the period between 2011 and 2015, where Russia intervened. And I'm just curious, that built a set of paradigms in most people's minds about the fact that Syria was a place where outsiders were going to be dominant. And it sort of took away from the fact that there was a very dynamic situation on the ground. There were people who were not waiting for outside sponsorship to take action. And I'm just curious, having seen that picture unfold in Egypt, where you were an active participant, and other parts of the region, are we witnessing potentially the opening of another phase where actors in the region themselves become the chief authors, and regional players and great powers become either sort of ancillary or force multipliers?
Right. I mean, this is a great question, Andrew, and I believe that the Syrian case is going to offer some interesting insights about the interplay of domestic as well as regional and international actors. You're right in highlighting the fact that local agency on the ground has played a key role in pushing Syria to where it is right now, and local actors are multifaceted in Syria. The big players are the armed groups, which took over control, but there are players elsewhere. There's an interesting set of civil society actors which have been documenting human rights violations and atrocities, and are now coming out showcasing the crimes against humanity and the human rights atrocities in which the Assad regime was implicated. There are interesting groups which have been operating, non-violent, non-armed, unarmed groups which have been operating from outside of Syria, pushing forward all-inclusive governance models and national consensus building measures. The UN representative who visited Syria yesterday and the day before actually pushed forward one of the visions that the so-called national coalition, Syrian National Coalition, pushed forward. It's interesting, however, Andrew, to take note of the fact that the interference of the two big regional actors on the ground, Turkey and Israel, is clouding to a great extent the vision with which many in the region are looking at Syria right now. Because what people are taking note of is contested territory. What people are taking note of is a flow of arms and financial help which has been coming to radical groups from Turkey. So the question of local agency in the wider perception in the region seems to be weakened by the fact of two big regional powers interfering and taking the lead in determining what will happen next. Many Arabs took note of the fact that the chief of the Turkish intelligence visited Damascus and was seen on the streets walking around. And people doubt the fact whether this would go well with regard to Syrian sovereignty or not. Second big point is Syria is very similar to Lebanon, very similar to Iraq, but in different ways, is a multi-ethnic and multi-religious social fabric, where groups have shared histories of some sense of national identity, but they have divided histories as well of discrimination, long histories of oppression, depending on where you as a group stood in different previous periods of time. And that is also important to take into consideration with regard to local agency. Are we going to see an anti-Alawite, anti-Christian governance arrangement in Syria, or is the all-inclusive model going to take the lead? Are we going to see people once again coming back, many, but some leaving for fearing oppression against the background of ethnic and religious identities? These are questions which are too early to respond to, but it's important to keep them in mind.
Thanks, Omar. So let me turn now to Nicole. And as an expert, Nicole, on Iran, first and foremost, we've seen tremendous pressure being put on Iran's position in the region since the horrible terrorist attacks on October 7th. And I'm curious, given the series of setbacks that Iran suffered as a result of Hamas's terrorism, and then the Israeli campaign in Gaza, and the efforts to dismantle Hezbollah's leadership, and now the collapse of Iran's client regime in Syria, Iran has to rethink its role in this part of the Middle East and its ways of projecting power. And can you talk a little bit about the way that paradigm will have to be reshaped to preserve Iran's influence across a broad swath of the Middle East, where Iran had become so important and so influential?
Yeah, of course. I mean, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And this is a really important topic, and it's great to have the opportunity to speak about this. I mean, Iran's foreign policy and Iran's regional foreign policy in general was predicated on this doctrine of forward defense. It included proxies and also state actors like Syria, but also non-state actors like Hezbollah, as well as drones and missiles for forward projection in the Middle East. We've seen both of those pillars falter over the past year. I mean, starting from the horrific attacks on October 7th and the degradation of Iranian influence in Syria via Israeli strikes and real hits to Iranian command and control there, but also about how Iran's missile force was not able to really deter Israel despite the quite unprecedented displays of force that we saw in April and October. And then when the kind of rapid rebel advance occurred, Iran didn't seem prepared, at least, or even knowledgeable about what was happening at first. But they didn't really put up a resistance. And I think that was remarkable. And partly because, Hezbollah was degraded so heavily as a result of Israeli actions throughout the summer, and also its land invasion of Lebanon, and as well as its degradation of Lebanese Hezbollah's command and control. So Hezbollah pretty much wasn't this fighting force that was really central to both Iranian and Russian efforts in Syria. And without Hezbollah, there wasn't really an ability for Iran to launch a comprehensive ground campaign without mobilizing forces from Iran itself. Initially, it looked like Iran was going to mobilize Iraqi militias. However, after the Iraqi government pushed back on this, Iran, for one of the first times, really recognized Iraqi sovereignty and ceded to Iraqi demands, and didn't push forward with a kind of a massive mobilization. I mean, and that being said, is of course Iran's capabilities were very much weakened in the wake of this, but Iran still does have expeditionary forces. They had the Quds Force. They have active forces that could have in theory been deployed, but Iran didn't do that. And I think it was really emblematic of the hits that Iran has taken over the past year. And Iran gave up, I mean, some of its most valuable assets in Syria, and that was primarily its land border or land border crossing in Deir ez-Zor. It was Abu Kamal and also Al Qaim, which is where Iran would transfer weapons to Hezbollah. And so Iran withdrew and gave that up without any kind of resistance or fight. And so I think going forward, I mean, I think Amir really alluded to this, is it seemed very remarkable that Iran took this choice, considering the amount of money and assets that they've thrown into Syria since 2011, but also this long-standing relationship as one of the central nodes of Iran's axis of resistance. I mean, disappearing overnight, along with the real degradation to other parts of this axis of resistance. So I think within Iran, there's not only a concern about this spreading throughout the region and potentially weakening its influence in Iraq, but also in Yemen with the Houthi movement, but also Iran itself. I think the Israeli-Iran conflict has been really central to its decision-making these days. And there have been numerous statements coming out from Iranian officials that seem to indicate that this is not viewed very lightly. I mean, I think Iran is taking the situation in Syria and the hits to its influence quite seriously. However, I think there is a likelihood, or at least there may be a potential, that Iran might try to exploit some of the divisions in eastern Syria, northeastern Syria, to potentially reestablish control or to kind of capitalize on the situation in ways that it had before. But I think the prospect of Iran restoring its presence or restoring its influence in Syria, akin to under Assad, is very unlikely at this point. Iran has faced devastating losses when it comes to its influence. It doesn't mean Iran is essentially, weak and helpless, but it does indicate that Iran's unlikely. It's very unlikely that Iran will, launch a massive campaign to restore its former status in the region.
Thanks, Nicole. Let me just continue with you for a second and talk about the arrival of the Trump administration and the likely focus that the Trump administration will have on intensifying pressure on Iran and taking advantage of all the setbacks that you just described. I'm just sort of curious to what extent you think the alignment of the Trump administration and the Israeli government to sort of keep Iran on the back foot and to reinstate some form of maximum pressure. How does Iran respond to that, if my presumption about that is correct?
I mean, Iran has already been anticipating this, at least from what they've indicated. I mean, there's been two tracks. On one hand, you see Iranians, including former Foreign Minister Zarif, who's currently serving in the presidential administration, write op-eds, kind of reaching out to the United States as a potential negotiation. But then you also see a lot of statements coming out of Iran about the need to at least find a different or more credible way of deterring or withstanding potential pressure from the Trump administration. And of course, the most obvious option there is its nuclear program. I mean, today, Iran's nuclear program is more advanced than it's ever been. It's essentially unrestrained. So the Trump administration will be coming into Iran, into this kind of challenge and facing not only Iran at the cusp of actually having the ability to have at least the fissile material and potentially even the ability to weaponize within months of its administration, but also Iran that feels vulnerable because of its loss of its forward defense doctrine. And also, I mean, Iran has faced a bit of setbacks at home when it came to Israeli strikes on Iranian territory. Israel essentially knocked out Iran's acquisition radars for its air defenses. So that means Iran is essentially blind when it comes to further airstrikes. So I think in Iran, there's a recognition that there may be a very long and prolonged confrontation, whether it be direct or not. I think that's still unknown. I think there's still some hope, at least within some parts of the Iranian establishment, that this could lead to some agreement. Because there has been conflicting signals from the Trump administration. However, what has changed, and I think this is really interesting in terms of Iran's environment, is Iran has improved its relations with a lot of the countries that it had very acrimonious ties to during the first Trump administration, namely Saudi Arabia, but also the UAE. And there's also been an outreach to countries that Iran has had tense ties to, like Bahrain. Prior to the Israeli strikes in October, Iran had this major outreach to the region, and it included countries like Egypt that Iran didn't necessarily have close ties to as well as Bahrain. So Iran's regional standing, I think, is somewhat improved, at least at the state level. But this isn't the kind of coercive influence that really bolstered its standing through kind of the axis of resistance. It's much more state-based, and it's not comprehensive, though it is a distinction, I think, from the first Trump administration.
Thanks, Nicole. Let me turn to you, Dr. Abdulaziz, about this new order that's emerging, in which you've seen tremendous disruption since October 7th, and now with the fall of the Assad regime. A lot of our core assumptions have been undermined about Iran's power. We've seen changes in the U.S. stance, where the U.S. looks like it's catching up and sort of behind the curve. And we see, to a certain extent, the desire for hedging from countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE to build ties to China and to Iran, and to Russia. All of that looks maybe less black and white as it did in the post-2015 period. So I'm just sort of curious, are we witnessing, as I mentioned earlier, a period where the paradigms have to change, or are we going to see a continuation of the patterns that have been in place since 2015?
Thank you for your question, and good morning to you. For us, it's good evening. I'm in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia now. Let me start by saying one of the first disappointment in the region here started during the time of President Obama, when he said the red line in Syria, and that red line not been implemented and just allowed the Russian to expand in Syria. So that this is the first time Russia returned back to the region. It's after that sort of red line have been said or drawn and never been implemented during the time of President Obama. Now, the current situation for us in Syria today, if I may clearly define it in the way how I see it, there is three different interests in Syria. i.e. the American wanted to see Russia out. The Turk, they wanted to make sure that there is no Kurdistan in Syria. And the Israeli, they want to make sure that Hezbollah and Iran do not exist anymore in Syria. With the 500 attacks that the Israeli have done in Syria and the expansion of the territorial, which was agreed in 1974, I think there is two messages there very clear. One, the Israeli wanted to make sure that Syria will remain as neutralized with no military capability whatsoever to threaten Israel, or that military supply that used to go to Hezbollah and Hamas do not exist anymore. So that's the Israeli interest, the way how I see it from my end. There are people in Syria and out Syria, they feel happy that the Israelis have destroyed that military capability, because it used to be the one who supplied the Russian missiles to the Hezbollah, which was used, and have escalated the situation between Lebanon and Israel that have led to all this disaster situation today. In no means what Hamas have started in Gaza on 7th of October 2023 was endorsed or supported or even recognized by the region here. The region felt that somebody have taken the decision to slow down the rapprochement and the enhancement of the relation between countries like Saudi Arabia and the US, talking about the three different, the triangle relation, which is Saudi wishes for the security umbrella, the nuclear program, peaceful nuclear program, and then the two-state solution to work it out. However, today I think looking at the relation between the region and how the region perceive the situation in Syria, country like UAE totally against that, and they don't want to see any Islamist group. Country like Saudi Arabia have taken a very balanced situation, and by saying it's the right of the Syrian people to choose. However, we would like to see a unified Syria and not a fragmented Syria, and we wanted to see no external power that will disturb the process of that one. But still, Syria is a very big, quite complicated when you look at it. It's a complicated mosaic between Shia, Sunna, Alawi, Kurd, Druze, different ethnicity, different, groups there. I'm expecting the wars to happen there. Unfortunately, I don't see the best scenario of everybody agreeing. I think on Friday we will see in different cities in Syria embracing Ahmed al-Shara or al-Julani, as it used to be called, embracing him and endorsing his leadership. But still, that does not mean all the Syrian people are in support and endorsement. They're all happy to get rid of Bashar and his regime. We would have never thought Bashar regime, have done all what they have done until we saw all the prisoners when they're open and all this, misery that they used to live in it and so. My expectation, as I said, I will expect the new leadership in Syria moving towards certain area in Lebanon, like Ba'labak and other area where Hezbollah is still there, because then they can use the reason that still Hezbollah is hosting some of al-Assad regime people, and that's one. And second, historically, there has been a struggle between the two, Hezbollah and the Islamist group, which, Ahmed al-Sheikh used to be the head of al-Nusra. And today he's bringing a lot of his Nusra people, which was the division of the Al-Qaeda before. Iran did not like that they had to leave it like this, obviously. But at the same time, I can see Iran endorsing and supporting to some extent ISIS, because ISIS is the one that really can fight against the current regime there and use that sort of leverage. Iraq will be next in line. Today we just received the Prime Minister of Iraq to Saudi Arabia visiting the Crown Prince. And he has been sending messages before that the central government in Baghdad has no control over the Hashd al-Sha'bi, the militant group there. But I think they're all in a standby. And Iran, of course, everybody talk about rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. I think it was a technical rapprochement and not really a full engagement rapprochement. In other words, what happened in March 2023 was re-establishing the diplomatic relation and having the direct negotiation instead of going through Baghdad or Oman. But we have not yet moved, with the exception of the de-escalation in media and also the establishing the embassies. There is no way cooperation can be established between Iran and Saudi Arabia in any economic further, because that would mean we are violating the U.S. sanction, and the U.S. sanction Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf. They do not wish to be on a secondary sanction to be imposed on them. Russia, by the way, it's a minor player for us in the region here. Russia, thanks to the American licensing to them, to bring them in again to the region, Russia is a producer of a raw material like us. We do not believe in their military capability. Seeing what happened in Ukraine send a very clear signal that it is not the country that you can rely on their military capability or so. However, they can always destroy, they can always stop, they can always be the negative player. China is a different story, because China today, their trade relation with Saudi Arabia goes to up to $110 billion, which means that's above the whole trade relation with the EU, which is 27 countries there. But still, China is a large importer of energy source from the Gulf. Almost 40% or 42% of their import of oil and gas comes out of the Gulf, out of the Strait of Hormuz. And Saudi Arabia is almost 50% of that, 2 million barrels a day. But still, that's a buyer and seller relation. It did not move toward a strategic relation, i.e. that China can play a significant role in the regional security here. But looking at at the whole picture, I think U.S. remains the main and the most important military security strategic partner for the region. Are we happy and satisfied with the U.S. behavior in the region? My personal view, I would say, no. I think we do have certain concern. And if I remember, it was President Obama, it was President Trump during his terms in 2017. He was the one who have agreed to move the embassy to Jerusalem in Palestine there, and he was the one who gave Golan to the Israeli. He was the one who accepted the settler. He was the one who did not want to defend Saudi Arabia when they were attacked from Iran on the critical oil facility. He was the one who decided not to respond to the attack of the U.S. drone. So all of that, we still remember that it was him. Yes, he acted like a good behavior, but still, from my point of view, we see it as a transactional relation. And where that transactional relation will take us, the people he have selected in his administration dealing with issues related to the Middle East are almost the hardliner. But also at the same time, let me explain that his policy toward Iran will have a complete impact on us in the region. Should he decide to de-escalate with Iran and take a position of cooperating or so, this will be at the account and the expense of the Gulf country. If he decides with Israel to go aggressively and do an attack, whatever sort of attack that will be, whether in some of the nuclear facility or some of the other critical facility in Iran, the response from Iran will be on the Gulf. So in both cases, we need to be careful what sort of decision will be made and taken by President Trump when it comes toward Iran. The wishful thinking and the hope that the personal relation that he enjoys in the region here, that this will help to enhance security, stability, and to bring more significant role, giving the old historical social relation, people to people, between the Gulf people and the American. But still, we just have to wait and see.
Thank you, Dr. Abdulaziz. Let me turn to Isaac now. And we've just heard Dr. Abdulaziz talk about Russia as a minor player, and then also almost in a similar exact tone about China. I guess it was 16, 18 months ago that we had China be such a visible player in at least the technical rapprochement, to use Dr. Abdulaziz's term, about Iran and Iranian relations. I'm sorry, Iran and Saudi relations. I'm just curious, is China punching at its weight, or there is no weight except as an economic player? Is it a security player in this region at all? Can you talk a little bit about what the past year or so has revealed?
Sure. Well, thank you, Andrew, and thanks to all my colleagues for teeing up such a fascinating discussion. As someone who usually focuses on China and Asia, that seems all pretty straightforward and easy in comparison to the region that we're discussing today. But in response to your question, I think China has not yet decided how hard to punch in the region. Its capabilities are greater than they used to be, but I tend to agree with Dr. Sagar that they're not playing a very significant regional security role. But I guess what I would offer as a complement to that argument is that, yes, China, certainly from a military capability standpoint, from a clients in the region advancing Chinese interest standpoint, is certainly behind the other great powers on the security front. We can talk about the economic issues separately. What they're providing is regime security rather than regional security as their primary goal. When we look at the banner Chinese initiatives like the Global Security Initiative, or if we look more acutely at some of the bilateral relationships, what you see is something that's not symmetric with what the United States does in the region, which is to say focus on regional security, focus on arming partners such that they can create a balance in the region or support US objectives. What we see in China's case is them providing essentially the types of security that they think about back in Beijing. This idea of political security, this idea of regime security, this idea of suppressing domestic opposition, of undermining currents of liberal thought and democratic norms that course through the region and that are attributed in the Chinese mind largely to American and Western influence. So, what does that mean for China's role in the region moving forward? I think the first thing to say is that they've tended to be quite conservative. They haven't, with the important exception of the Iran-Saudi rapprochement, haven't tried to take a leading role in virtually any facet of regional affairs. And I think they're going to be watching very closely to see what happens with Russia, as we all are. I think to the extent that Russia remains embedded in the region and capable of mounting a sort of at least a minimal denial campaign, or as Dr. Sagar pointed out, being able to play a negative role as opposed to a positive role in producing outcomes, but just frustrating the designs of other regional players, and in particular the United States, I think China will remain relatively content to be primarily an economic actor. But I do think that the conventional wisdom in the region that the United States as a security actor and China as an economic actor is eroding very quickly. China is very focused on a different brand of security, a different type of security in the region, and that's what I'm going to watch moving forward, to include in places like Syria. If you look at the Chinese discourse in the immediate aftermath of this, first thing to say is they're being quite non-committal, as they have been in virtually every conflict. They seem to have been wrong-footed by it, like everyone else, and they don't have a system that's very conducive to taking a quick action unless and until the senior leadership decides what they want to do. But the second thing to say is the vast majority of the commentary has been on what role China can play in the reconstruction of Syria. And I think in that case, what really focuses the Chinese mind is this idea that there was a forcible deposition of an autocratic leader in the region. This is not a pattern that China welcomes. This is reminiscent, of course, of the Arab Spring in 2011. In fact, I'm sure regional experts can draw a straight line between the Assad regime's regime security and that sort of previous earthquake in the region in 2011. China looks at that and doesn't necessarily say, it's us next. They don't face the type of security situation that the Assad regime did in Syria, but basically their focus is on the stability of the region and the stability of regimes, in particular autocratic regimes whom they perceive to be vulnerable to Western pressure, to include ideological pressure. So I think we should expect to see China looking most concertedly at how can they play a largely economic and diplomatic role in brokering some sort of a peaceful, stable situation in Syria, but again, lagging behind the other great powers in terms of really sticking its neck out on security issues?
So, Nicole, a lot of what I heard Isaac said could be applied to Russia. And I'm just curious about sort of two issues that are sort of were in the conventional wisdom until the Syrian revolution. One was the idea that Russia is a great insurance policy, similar to China, that can provide regime security and other sort of Praetorian services on demand across the region and also into Africa. And two, the notion that Russia, Iran, North Korea were forming, along with China, a group of countries that were willing to do and make huge investments to counter US influence and to undermine the post-1989 global system with the US at the head. And I'm curious, now that we've seen even in the first days of the aftermath of the Syrian revolution, we're seeing documents being released that show that Russia was facilitating Israeli military strikes on Iranian targets inside Syria. So you see levels of rivalry and double dealing in which, you know, Russia isn't either, as Isaac said, it's not a safeguarding force, it's actually a pretty craven actor. And lastly, you know, we've seen Russia largely benefit since October 7th as a you know, kind of propaganda player that just uses the misery of the situation that resulted during the Israeli military campaign in Gaza to just undermine US and European global image without really doing very much to affect events on the ground. So I know that's a pretty broad-ranging question to you, but again, I'm just curious how you sort of think now of Russia as an actor in the region, having seen these rapidly unfolding events.
No one really saw Russia. I mean, I think within the region, no one really saw Russia as replacing the US in terms of influence. I think that's somewhat of a misconception from usually from the kind of side of the rhetoric that comes about kind of outsizing Russian influence. I mean, Russia's intervention in Syria in 2015 was very limited. Of course, it projected itself as kind of this great power that was concerned about stability and regime security. And I think actually there were genuine concerns within Russia that the fall of Assad would lead to kind of rampant instability like in Libya. But of course, Russia eventually ended up capitalizing on the kind of unrest and the kind of civil war that emerged after the Libya intervention in 2011. And you see actually Russia deploying private military companies to Libya in around 2014-ish. And then on top of that is when it comes to Syria and the Gulf, and I mean, Russia had outreach through arms. I mean, this has historically been a relationship it's sustained with Algeria, for example, with Syria, with Iran. But Russia never really had the economic largesse of China or even the United States to heavily invest or be this security provider in the Middle East. In around, I think, 2019, they presented this comprehensive peace plan for the Middle East, but it was really lacking character. It was quite hollow. And I think you could see that actually transcending into Syria is a lot of Russia's efforts at reforming or at least strengthening the Assad regime ultimately ended up making Assad much weaker. I mean, it's security service reform, its Syrian army reform proved to be quite shallow. I mean, it was really about creating Russia, like allegiances to Russia. And this, of course, was in competition at times to Iran and was also in competition to Turkey. But I do think that there is a vision of Russia, at least in the region, especially in Iran, for example, of Russia's ability to provide some sort of authoritarian control. And this is where I think the North Korea, Iran, China, you know, formerly Syria dynamic emerges, is that all of these countries are concerned about domestic stability and regime control. And Russia does have this authoritarian toolkit, this like repertoire of repression that they've lodged at home, that they've assisted countries on this. They've assisted Iran in terms of bulking up its internal security apparatus and bulking up its ability to target certain cyber threats and actually execute offensive cyber operations. There's been increasing evidence that Iran is now bearing the resemblance of a lot of Russian cyber attacks or alleged Iranian cyber attacks. But then on top of that, I think when we look at Russia and the kind of where it goes from here, I don't see Russia playing a bigger role than it ever did, during the height of its influence under the Assad regime. But I do think that Russia does have some interests that might be able to be maintained. And one thing I think is also a misconception about Russia and Syria is that Russia did outreach to a lot of these opposition groups, not only through the Astana process, which was initially supposed to be this forum for reconciliation between Assad and also Syrian opposition forces, but also through the Sochi process. So Russia does have contacts with some of these opposition groups beyond HTS, though there's indications that Russia is making amends, or at least attempting to, at least to preserve its bases in Tartus and Latakia. But I think Russia, the kind of great power competition that Russia tried to construct about this alternative to the Western-led international order, ultimately ended up proving quite hollow. And the kind of abandonment of Assad showed that, the strategy that relied on Iranian ground forces, relied on Hezbollah, was ultimately not sustainable in the long term, especially as Russia was, engaged in the war in Ukraine. So this is kind of an interesting way of, I think, it's a kind of comes full circle. Is that Russia initially intervened in Syria to show that it was a great power, but then ultimately its kind of the loss of Assad's control showed that Russia does have these weaknesses, and it's not this kind of alternative great power that it thought itself to be at the initial stages of the campaign.
Thanks so much, Nicole. So we've been receiving questions from a variety of sources who are watching us on Google, YouTube, and people in the room. And I would just encourage everyone in the remaining time, I'm going to bring these questions in to keep submitting them. So let me turn to you first, Amr, with one of these questions, which talks about what does the past month or two teach us about great power competition and how relevant it is as a framework for understanding developments in the Middle East, given that it's countries like Israel, Turkey, and Iran that have generated much of the transformative events of the past 18 months or so. So I'm just sort of curious, are we thinking about this the right way? And do we need new paradigms?
I mean, this is a great question. Thank you, Andrew. I believe, following the great points made by Nicole, Abdelaziz, and Isaac, there's a great deal of misconception about each one of the three great powers we're looking at. And I believe the same can be extended to the Europeans as well. There's a misconception. There's been a misconception that Russia has re-entered the Middle East scene in the aftermath of 2011 to primarily sustain the Assad regime and support it. In fact, Russia has always seen, and the Soviet Union has always seen in Syria, a key strategic ally in the region, and they actually have never disappeared from the Syrian context prior to 2011 and post-2011. This is a historical continuity, which, however, never transcended the borders of Syria. Russia was relevant sometimes in Egypt, relevant for Algeria, relevant for trade relations from a UAE perspective, less for Saudi Arabia, but Russia has never assumed an all-inclusive relevance and significance as a trade partner, as a supplier of weapons across the region, across the Middle East and North Africa. China has always been a trade giant, less interested for its own calculations and in getting itself invested in regional conflict, especially when it comes to intrastate wars. I mean, the bold step which the Chinese took in 2023 to mediate between the Iranians and the Saudis was tailored to restore diplomatic relations and as a byproduct to pacify or stabilize the situation in Yemen. But they did not make most of what we expected them to be pushing for. They didn't actually care a lot about building on it to capitalize on it and gain more strategic significance. And the widely rumored retreat of the U.S., especially in the last decade, about the U.S. retreating in the region, cannot be, in fact, by virtue of empirical evidence, by virtue of facts on the ground, cannot be pushed forward unquestioned. The U.S. is not retreating. The U.S. continues to be the most relevant international power from a security perspective. In fact, when it comes to military relations, government-to-government relations, the U.S. is maybe the one great power which has mostly restricted its relations to governments, has not opened up, with the exception of the Kurds in Syria, to non-state actors. That's one. The second point is we're looking, I mean, to your question, who is actually taking the lead strategically? I believe as of now, because this is a region in a war of attrition, very similar to what Abdulaziz will know about the 1960s in the Arab world, where we had a great host of wars, intrastate wars, wars between governments and militias, governments and non-state actors. This is once again repeating itself in the region. And on the ground, regional actors are more up to speed, more able to move, and more able to impact transformative changes and push forward transitional energy, similar to the one which we're seeing in Syria in different ways. If I take away my sort of Arab identity, when I look at Syria, if I look at it in a less emotional way, I'm seeing a country similar to Abdulaziz approaching fragmentation, approaching a territory being contested by the Turks in the north, by the Israelis in the south, Kurdish groups elsewhere. Kurdish groups are part of the Syrian social fabric, but there are different ways of including them in a united Syria, not fragmenting the country. So if I'm less emotional about it, I see once again the Pandora's box of the Levant with its mosaic, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, being impacted by the transitions on the ground because regional actors are unrestrained. Final point, the real question at the end of the day is about regional security arrangements. Do we have anyone in the great powers or in regional powers with a clear vision with regard to how to stabilize the region, how to move beyond the current war of attrition and stabilize the region? I'm afraid even the 7 regional actors, which I referred to at the beginning, including Saudi Arabia, including Egypt, including the UAE, do not have a clear vision for stabilizing a region and agreeing on a set of norms and principles to come out to a regional security framework. To expect the US to deliver it under the Trump administration, I believe is misguided. It's not going to happen, which will leave the region at the mercy, if you do not like it, or at the advantage of different regional actors.
So that's a perfect segue for a question that came in online for Dr. Abdulaziz about how important players like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are likely to respond to the grassroots and elite pressure within the Trump administration. Let me rephrase that. The Trump administration's instinct, as expressed by President Trump himself, as well as bottom-up pressure for the United States to continue to back away from its investment in the Middle East and its presence and to retrench and regroup. And so the question for you is, do you think that isolationist sentiment that's pretty dominant in US foreign policy thinking in the Trump world is going to be decisive? Is it a structural factor that regional players like Saudi Arabia are all now going to have to adjust to? And then given what we've seen in the last hour of conversation about Russia and China, the hedging opportunities are not necessarily as promising as they were originally thought to be.
Thank you for the question. I think, if I remember well, President Trump, he came up through Jared Kushner with what we call deal of the century. And that deal of the century did not address anything politically with regard to the Palestinians, so it was more of an economic. Are we going to see a new suggesting, a new edition of that deal of the century? I'm not so sure. But at the same time, I think no matter how the US threatened to withdraw from the region, I think they can reduce their military capability or presence in the region as far as boots on the ground, because they still can use their long-range missiles, long-range, technical capability to deal with the threat when it comes into the region. The US, they may reduce their presence, they may reduce their military capability, but they will never leave the region, and they will never allow other power to enter into the region. This is, I think it's very clear in our mind. We've heard it from different presidents saying we will leave the region, but still, I think what will happen, we're going to see maybe reduction of military capability, but they will never allow other power to replace. Neither the Chinese nor the Russian have the capability to replace the US. The US, maybe they are willing to allow the region to enhance their capability and maybe empower them with a different sort of capability, particularly country like Saudi Arabia, UAE, where this can help to support when it comes to the defensive position that they need to because of the threat element in the region. But still, in my opinion, I don't see that sort of replacement, neither by the Russian nor the Chinese, to be here in the region. And I think we're going to see President Trump maybe promoting a sales of a new weapon system, but not providing a security umbrella as the region wanted. Yes, what agreement has been signed with UAE as a partnership like India, it's an interesting one, but it's not a security guarantor, which the region they were looking for in, at a certain time.
Thank you so much. So Isaac, a question's come in from online for you. Do you expect other Chinese military bases to pop up in the region in the coming years? And if so, what would that signal about China's plans and goals?
Sure. So it's worth noting to set the baseline, Djibouti on the Horn of Africa, adjacent to the region and within scope for our discussion today, is China's only declared overseas base, and it's been there since 2017, and there has not been a further declared base, although the facilities in Cambodia look awfully like it. So that's the baseline. China has for a very long time had a policy, a declaratory policy, that they would never station troops abroad. The Djibouti base in 2017 was a pretty radical change in that direction, and there were a lot of people back then who imagined that's going to open the floodgates, and you would have a lot of interest because of China's economic relationships, because of its broader overseas interests, as the Chinese articulated, that they would want to protect it. But I would say, a lot depends on how the various conflicts raging in the region play out over time. But I think we have an interesting illustration of China's sort of relative lack of utilization of a forward deployed kind of boots on the ground footprint in the region since the Houthi attacks began in the Red Sea. These are immediately adjacent to China's base. They have a task force of 3 naval ships typically operating in the region at all times, and yet they basically didn't utilize that facility, haven't participated in any of the efforts to stabilize or open that sea lane. And prior to that event, I think a lot of people would have looked at it and say, this is exactly the reason that China ought to have an overseas base. They have these broad overseas interests. China is more dependent on flows of especially energy resources, but on this two-way trade across the Indian Ocean. It's worth noting that Red Sea channel is China's main line of connection to Europe, its biggest export market, and of course, something like 40 to 50% of China's imported oil comes from the region. And so I think based on past precedent, which I think we certainly can't rest on given the fluidity of the situation, China is going to be very reticent to further expose itself in the region and set itself up to potentially have to play a more active role in the region. If I were betting on it and I had to choose another location where we might see a substantial Chinese military presence, I would say the UAE and or Pakistan are places where China has worked quite hard to develop along the lines of these regime security relationships that I've described. And I think it won't resemble, for example, the CENTCOM footprint in the region as China moves into it. I don't anticipate any significant laydown of Chinese forces, but you could imagine in the UAE a major intelligence post. You could imagine in Pakistan the ability to surge some forces into the region and perhaps protect the Straits of Hormuz. And in that case, the role of China would be much more narrowly circumscribed than what we've seen from the United States, and I'd say even from Russia. I would expect China to look to convoy its own energy moving out of the Gulf. I would expect China to try and rescue through non-combatant evacuation some of its own citizens. But the idea of China building a base in order to project power regionally, to engage, for example, in another Syrian civil war or in whatever else spills out of the ongoing crises, I think is pretty unrealistic.
Thanks. Let me turn that question around and put it to Nicole, which is, there's been so much focus on the Russian military presence in Syria that's been built up that was fairly nominal in the pre-2015 period and has since been built up. How much relevance do you feel that presence, that military presence, is for the Russian leadership going forward? Is it there to just demonstrate that Russia is a player, and it has been involved in the Middle East for hundreds of years, and it ever so, it's important that it remain ever such, or is it a tool for power projection, and that's why you see this kind of fixation on basing and trying to kind of create as big a footprint as possible, including into parts of North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa?
I mean, if you look at the historical side of it's a kind of acquisition of Tartus, which is the naval facility. It's not a base necessarily. It's a facility. It's not a deep water naval facility. It was primarily used for refueling during the Soviet era for forward projection. And this was partly because there were setbacks when it came to other basing aspirations from the Soviet Union, including with Egypt. And so this led to Tartus being quite valuable in terms of the Soviets' naval projection capabilities. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia retained Tartus. Though it was mostly used as a refueling facility, you didn't see high levels of activity. It did grow in prominence during the early stages of the Syrian civil war, and it became dubbed the Syrian Express, where you would see Russian military equipment go through Tartus onto the regimes to support the repression of Syrian civilians. But Russia then established, prior to its intervention, an airbase in Khmeim, which is in Latakia, and this has been primarily where Russia has conducted a lot of its aerial operations, though they have conducted some actually from Russian territory. These bases are not only important just in terms of Russia's so-called influence or its ability to do operations if there need be in the region, though I think that's unlikely, but it's also important for some of its activities in Africa. And these are major areas where Russia will unload equipment, to refuel, to be able to supply its Africa Corps with equipment, or also to replenish troops over there. So there's that kind of logistical side of it that's really important. And I think it's foreseeable that Russia may have some kind of negotiation with whatever rebel side or now government side in Syria, whoever ends up controlling those regions, to maintain that presence. But it's not going to be the level of heightened Russian activity, even when there was kind of a drawdown after the Assad regime took a lot of territory after 2019. So in some ways, it's mostly logistical, but I do think there's a sense of it that also is, this perception of Russia as a greater power than it is, and this base for a while did kind of exemplify that. Though it's not such a high-level asset that you would see Russia, deploying additional troops for at the moment.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm looking at the questions we've gotten online, and I'm conscious of our time. Maybe one final question for you, Amr, which I think plays to some of your background and your scholarship. Is there a pathway for Syria's diverse civil society actors to positively influence the structure of Syria's new government, given the many armed local and international actors jostling for influence? Is it naive or overly optimistic to think that a civilian/constitutional government could emerge as the best middle ground for all competing local actors, and that they might recognize it as such? We like to end on an optimistic note at Carnegie.
It's a legitimate hope, I would say. I wouldn't describe it as naive. It's a legitimate hope. However, when I look at, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to end maybe on an optimistic note, I will try. When I look at the details on the ground, I see radical groups operating within each one of them, by the way, Andrew. HTS and away from the Kurdish groups, maybe as the only exception, there's an Arab Syrian component and a foreign fighter component. Once again, I mean, this is sort of emulating some of the worst issues we have known about Al-Qaeda and ISIS before. Deterritorialized violence from foreign fighters. I mean, Al-Jolani's scene in the Umayyad Mosque was not simply his scene, it was his scene and his fighters, Syrian fighters and foreign fighters as well. this is an extremely difficult issue to manage. Second point, we are in a region in which we have many civil wars: Libya, Sudan, Yemen, still more or less, difficult experience in Iraq for many years. And when I look at Syria right now, the question becomes, is there on the ground in terms of institutions or remaining elements of a state apparatus that can do an inclusive process by means of which those groups get included in a national army? I'm not so sure. Then I have regional actors who are not interested in seeing maybe Syria remains in its own territory and territorially integrated as it is now, and having more interest in undermining relative autonomy for the Kurds, Turkey, or contesting more territory in the south, Israel. And I have doubts about the territorial integrity of Syria as such. So in general, while it's very legitimate, and the legitimate hope to say that civil society in Syria, which has learned a lot over the last 15 years, should play a role, needs to play a role. Nicole referred to the Asatana process. There are different other processes of national consensus building measures that have been pushed forward in recent years. They should still resort to it. They should try to impact change on the ground, but I believe it's going to be very difficult.
Well, terrific. I think that's a good note to end it on. Thank you so much to my colleagues here in Washington, Isaac Harden and Amr Hamzawi, and on the screen, Nicole Graevsky, and as well to Dr. Abdulaziz. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and look forward to another event lab following up on our project in the coming months.
Thank you, Andrew, so much. Thank you.